The drill bit had barely kissed the concrete when the sharp click, click, click of heels snapped up my driveway like a warning shot. Victoria Harmon, the HOA queen herself, was clutching her clipboard like it was a badge of divine authority. I had lived here for 2 weeks, and somehow my address was already circled in red. Before you hear what happened next, drop a comment telling me where you are watching from. The way she smiled, tight and icy, told me everything I needed to know. She strutted closer, eyeing my flagpole base as if it were a crime scene. And I felt that familiar burn in my gut. She had no idea she had just picked the worst possible moment to start a war with me. 2 days before Victoria Harmon showed up on my driveway, my wife Tessa and I had been painting the back fence together, laughing about nothing in particular, dreaming out loud about the garden she wanted to plant in spring. We had just moved to Oakridge Estates after 15 years of apartment living, and everything felt new. The mountain air, the silence at night, the simple pleasure of owning something that was finally, completely ours. I had served 12 years with the Coast Guard as a rescue helicopter pilot, pulling people out of hurricanes and sinking boats, and all I wanted now was peace. Tessa worked remotely as a real estate attorney, and this house was supposed to be our fresh start. That afternoon, while we painted, a black Mercedes rolled slowly past our property. The driver stared at our yard for a long moment before moving on. I noticed, but I did not think much of it. That was my first mistake. The morning Victoria appeared. I was installing a flagpole in the front yard, not just any flag. This was the flag that had flown on my helicopter during my final rescue mission, a night operation off the coast of North Carolina, where we pulled 11 souls from a capsizing fishing vessel. I had carried that flag through 3 duty stations and two hurricanes, and it meant more to me than I could explain to a stranger. The concrete was still wet around the base when I heard those heels coming up the driveway. Victoria introduced herself with a handshake that felt rehearsed, her eyes scanning my property even as she spoke. She mentioned she was the HOA president, that she liked to personally welcome new residents, that Oakridge was a community built on standards. The word standards came out of her mouth like a velvet threat. Then she noticed the flagpole. She asked if I had submitted an architectural approval form. I told her I had read the CC&Rs cover to cover before closing, and there was no restriction on flagpoles under 10 feet. She smiled that icy smile again. The rules can be interpreted in many ways. Mr. Huxley, I'm sure we will find common ground. She left without another word, but I saw her write something on her clipboard as she walked away. 48 hours later, a letter arrived in my mailbox. Official HOA stationery. Violation. Notice number 2024-0089. 2 violations listed. First, the flagpole had not received prior architectural approval. Second, my fence exceeded the maximum height by 2 inches. The letter demanded corrective action within 7 days, or I would face fines of $100 per day. I stood in my kitchen reading it twice, then a third time. Tessa came up behind me, read over my shoulder, and let out a short laugh. "Caleb, this is textbook intimidation. They are testing whether we will roll over." She was right. I had measured that fence myself. It was exactly at the limit, and the CC&R said nothing, absolutely nothing, about flagpoles requiring approval. That night, I drafted a polite but firm email to the HOA board, citing the exact sections of the CC&Rs that proved both violations were baseless. I asked for a formal response within 5 business days. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. The next evening, I was watering the new shrubs Tessa had planted along the side of the house when I noticed the woman across the street watching me from behind her curtain. Harold Chen, a woman in her late 60s who had lived in Oakridge for over 20 years. She stepped out onto her porch, pretending to check her mailbox, and I waved. She hesitated, then walked slowly toward the edge of her property. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she spoke. "Be careful with Mrs. Harmon. The last person who challenged her ended up selling their house at a loss just to get away." Before I could ask what she meant, a white pickup truck with the logo of a landscaping company rolled past. Eleanor glanced at it, then retreated inside without another word. The truck slowed in front of my house, and I saw Marcus Delgado, the HOA vice president, behind the wheel. He did not wave. He just looked at my flagpole, then at me, then drove on. That night, I told Tessa what Eleanor had said. She pulled up her laptop and started digging into public records. Within an hour, she had found something interesting. Marcus Delgado's landscaping company had been formed 2 months after he joined the HOA board. Its only client, as far as she could tell, was Oakridge Estates HOA. Over 6 years, the HOA had paid his company more than $400,000. Tessa looked at me with that sharp expression I had seen 100 times in our marriage. "Where is that money really going?" "Caleb." I did not have an answer yet, but I knew one thing for certain. Victoria Harmon had picked the wrong house to target. I had spent 12 years flying into storms that would terrify most people, and I had never once turned back. A clipboard and a fake smile were not going to make me start now. That night, before we went to bed, I looked out the window toward Victoria's house at the end of the street. The lights were still on, and I could have sworn I saw a silhouette standing at her window, looking back at me. Chapter 2, Early Reveal, The First Cracks. The monthly HOA meeting was held on a Tuesday evening in the community hall, a bland building near the entrance of Oakridge Estates that smelled like old carpet and stale coffee. Tessa and I arrived early, hoping to observe before we engaged. About 40 residents filled the metal folding chairs, most of them middle-aged or older, their faces carrying the particular weariness of people who had attended too many of these gatherings. Victoria Harmon stood at the front of the room behind a wooden podium, dressed in a cream-colored blazer that probably cost more than my first car. Marcus Delgado sat to her right at a long table, along with 2 other board members, whose names I did not catch. Victoria opened the meeting with a speech about community unity and shared responsibility, her voice smooth and practiced like a politician running for re-election. I noticed how she controlled the room. When someone raised a hand to speak, she decided whether to acknowledge them. When a question made her uncomfortable, she pivoted to a different topic with surgical precision. This was not a meeting. It was a performance. The main agenda item was a proposal to repair the community pool, and the number made my eyebrows rise. $85,000, awarded directly to Delgado Landscaping and Construction without competitive bidding. Victoria explained that Marcus had provided preferred vendor pricing as a courtesy to the community. An elderly man 3 rows ahead of me, someone later introduced as Mr. Patterson, raised his hand and asked why there were no other quotes for comparison. Victoria's smile tightened for just a fraction of a second before she responded. "Mr. Patterson, the board has thoroughly vetted this proposal. We do not have time to relitigate every decision in open forum." And Patterson started to speak again, but Victoria had already moved on to the next item. Tessa leaned close to my ear and whispered something that made my stomach drop. "There is no financial report in the packet they handed out. This is a budget meeting without any actual numbers." I flipped through the stapled pages they had given us at the door. She was right. Talking points. Vague summaries, but not a single line item. Not a single dollar figure beyond the pool repair. The meeting ended 30 minutes later with a unanimous board vote approving the contract. No resident vote, no discussion, just Victoria's gavel coming down like a judge delivering a sentence. 3 days later, Harold Chen invited me over for tea. She said it was to thank me for helping her move some boxes from her garage, but I knew there was more to it. Her living room was modest and tidy, filled with photographs of a man I assumed was her late husband. She poured oolong tea into ceramic cups and sat across from me with her hands folded in her lap. For a long moment, she said nothing, just studied my face as if deciding whether she could trust me. Then she began to talk. Eleanor had been an accountant for 35 years before retiring. 3 years ago, she had exercised her legal right as a homeowner to request the HOA's financial records. Victoria delayed for months, citing administrative backlogs and procedural requirements. When the documents finally arrived, Eleanor found inconsistencies that made no sense. Payments to vendors that did not appear to exist, service contracts with no corresponding work orders, and one line item that stuck in her memory to this day. $12,000 paid to something called legal consulting services in a year when the HOA had no attorney on retainer and no pending litigation. Eleanor brought her concerns to a board meeting. She asked simple questions. Where did this money go? Who approved these expenses? Why were there no receipts? Victoria's response was swift and devastating. She accused Eleanor of harassment, of spreading malicious rumors, of being a confused old woman who did not understand modern accounting practices. Within a week, Eleanor's car had been spray-painted with the word nosy in red letters. Her front window was shattered by a rock thrown in the middle of the night. She filed a police report. but the community security cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned during both incidents. No footage, no witnesses, no justice. Eleanor stopped attending meetings after that. She stopped talking to neighbors. She became a ghost in her own community, invisible and afraid. But she had kept copies of those financial documents, hidden in a fireproof safe in her closet. She handed me a single page, a photocopy of the line item showing that $12,000 payment. "I am too old to fight her," Eleanor said quietly. "But you are not, and I can see in your eyes that you are not the type to walk away." That night, Tessa and I turned our home office into a war room. She pulled public records from the Colorado Secretary of State database while I cross-referenced everything we knew. The picture that emerged was damning. Marcus Delgado's company, Delgado Landscaping and Construction, had been registered exactly 2 months after he joined the HOA board. Its business address was a P.O. box. Its listed employees numbered exactly 1, Marcus himself. Yet over 6 years, this one-man operation had received $423,000 in HOA contracts. Tessa dug deeper into Victoria's background. No formal employment since 2015. Her husband Derek had taken early retirement from an engineering firm with a modest pension. Their combined legitimate income could not possibly support the lifestyle Victoria displayed. The Mercedes, the designer handbags visible in her social media posts, annual ski trips to Aspen, a renovation of her kitchen that neighbors estimated cost at least $60,000. "The math does not work," Tessa said, rubbing her eyes, "unless the money is coming from somewhere else." I thought about my years working with the FBI on aviation insurance fraud cases, the shell companies and fake invoices and carefully layered deceptions. This had the same fingerprints, smaller scale, but the same rotten core. I was about to suggest we call it a night when headlights swept across our front windows. It was almost 2 in the morning. I moved to the window and saw a white pickup truck parked at the curb. 2 men stood on my lawn with measuring tapes and flashlights, taking notes on clipboards. The truck's logo was visible under the streetlight. Delgado Landscaping. I opened the front door and stepped onto the porch. The moment they saw me, both men scrambled back to the truck and drove off without a word. I stood there in the dark, heart pounding, watching their taillights disappear around the corner. By 8 the next morning, a new violation notice was in my mailbox. My grass had been measured at 3.75 inches, exceeding the maximum allowed height of 3.5 inches by 1/4 inch. The fine was $50, due within 10 days. I looked at the flag hanging from the pole Victoria wanted me to remove. It caught the morning breeze and unfurled slowly, the fabric rippling with the same quiet defiance I felt building in my chest. They could measure my grass at 2 in the morning. They could send their threatening letters, but I was done playing defense. It was time to find out exactly what Victoria Harmon was hiding, and make her answer for every dollar she had stolen from this community. I walked into the HOA office at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning with a formal written request for 5 years of financial records. Colorado state law was clear on this point. Homeowners had a legal right to inspect association financial documents, and the HOA was required to provide access within 10 business days. I had printed the relevant statute and attached it to my request, along with a polite cover letter explaining that I was simply exercising my rights as a dues-paying member of the community. The office was a small room attached to the community hall, furnished with a metal desk, 2 filing cabinets, and a dying potted plant in the corner. Victoria was already there when I arrived, sitting behind the desk as if she had been expecting me. She took my request, glanced at it briefly, and set it aside without reading the attached statute. "Of course, Mr. Huxley, we are always happy to accommodate transparency requests. However, our administrative process requires 30 to 45 days for document preparation." I reminded her that state law mandated 10 days. She tilted her head and smiled that smile I was beginning to recognize as a warning sign. "State law is a guideline, Mr. Huxley. Our internal procedures exist to protect the privacy of all residents." Before I could respond, the door opened behind me and Marcus Delgado walked in. Positioning himself between me and the exit, he did not say anything. He just stood there with his arms crossed, filling the doorway. Victoria's voice dropped half an octave. "I hope you are not planning to create a hostile environment for our volunteers. That would be very disappointing." The community social media group erupted 2 days later. I did not see the original post until Tessa showed me her phone that evening, her face tight with anger. Victoria had written a long message about certain new residents who seemed determined to undermine the harmony of Oakridge Estates. She never mentioned my name directly, but the implications were obvious. She wrote about people who moved into established communities and immediately began causing trouble, who questioned decisions made by dedicated volunteers, who seemed to think they knew better than neighbors who had lived here for decades. The comments section was a feeding frenzy. Someone called me a troublemaker who would drive down property values. Another suggested I should go back to wherever I came from if I did not like how things were run. A third made a snide remark about military types who thought they could order everyone around. But buried among the attacks, I noticed something else. A few comments defended the right to ask questions about community finances. These comments disappeared within minutes of being posted, scrubbed from the thread as if they had never existed. Late that night, my phone buzzed with a message from an account I did not recognize. The profile picture was blank. The username, a random string of numbers. The message was short. "You are not alone. There are others who know the truth. Do not give up." I spent the next week preparing my counterattack. Tessa helped me draft a formal complaint to the Colorado Division of Real Estate, which oversaw HOA regulations. We documented every violation of my rights: the delayed response to my records request, the baseless violation notices, the late-night trespassing by Delgado's employees. We also filed a separate request with the county clerk's office for any permits or contracts associated with Oakridge Estates HOA. On the 9th day after my original request, an email arrived from the HOA with a 3-page PDF attachment. I opened it expecting the full financial records I had demanded. Instead, I found a summary document with vague categories and round numbers: maintenance and repairs, $200,000; administrative costs, $45,000; vendor services, $160,000. No line items, no receipts, no vendor names. No breakdown of how a community of 80 homes could spend over $400,000 in a single year on a pool, some landscaping, and a part-time office manager. I compared the numbers to the documents Eleanor had given me. Nothing matched. The $12,000 legal consulting payment she had flagged was nowhere in this summary. It had simply vanished. The night everything changed started like any other evening. I had been away for 2 days on a consulting job, reviewing safety protocols for a private aviation company in Denver. Tessa picked me up from the airport, and I could tell something was wrong before she said a word. Her hands were tight on the steering wheel, her jaw clenched in that way that meant she was holding back something she did not want to say in public. When we pulled into our driveway, I understood. The flagpole was broken, not bent, not damaged by wind, broken cleanly in half, as if someone had taken a saw to it. The flag, my flag, the one I had carried through 12 years of service, lay crumpled in a muddy flower bed. Boot prints surrounded it, pressed wood deep into the wet soil. I stood there for a long moment, unable to speak. Tessa had already called the police, but they told her there was nothing they could do without evidence of who was responsible. Our security camera, the one I had installed specifically to watch the front yard, had been covered with a black plastic bag some time before the incident. The camera on the house across the street, the one that should have captured everything, had supposedly malfunctioned the day before. The officer who took our report seemed sympathetic, but helpless. Without footage or witnesses, it is just vandalism. It could have been anyone. Kids, maybe. I knew it was not kids. I knew exactly who was responsible, even if I could not prove it yet. That night, I washed the mud from the flag by hand, working carefully to remove every stain without damaging the fabric. Tessa watched me from the kitchen doorway, her arms wrapped around herself. "They want you to quit," she said softly. "They want you to sell the house and disappear like everyone else who challenged them." I hung the flag over a chair to dry and turned to face my wife. In 12 years of flying rescue missions, I had faced hurricanes that could flip a helicopter like a toy. I had dropped into seas so violent that the waves looked like mountains. I had pulled drowning strangers from the darkness while my own crew screamed coordinates over the roar of the wind. Not once, not ever, had I turned back from a mission because it was dangerous. "They picked the wrong person," I told her. "They think I am just another homeowner they can bully into silence. But I have faced worse than Victoria Harmon and her clipboard, and I am just getting started." The next morning, I ordered a new flagpole, taller, stronger, made of steel instead of aluminum, and I began making phone calls to people I had not spoken to in years. former colleagues, federal contacts, people who knew how to follow money through the darkest corners of the financial system. Victoria Harmon had declared war. She just did not realize yet that she was about to lose. Eleanor Chen's living room felt smaller with 6 people crowded into it. She had drawn the curtains and asked everyone to park on the next street over, precautions that seemed paranoid until I heard their stories. Besides Eleanor and me, there were 4 others, Mr. and Mrs. Patterson, the elderly couple I had seen at the HOA meeting, sat together on the love seat, holding hands like survivors of a shipwreck. James Thornton, a retired attorney in his early 50s, leaned against the bookshelf with his arms crossed and a permanent frown etched into his face. Maria Santos, a nurse who worked night shifts at the county hospital, perched on the edge of a dining chair she had carried in from the kitchen. These were the people Victoria Harmon had broken, and they had come out of hiding because they heard someone was finally fighting back. The Pattersons spoke first. 3 years ago, Victoria had cited them for a hedge that was supposedly 4 inches too tall. The fine started at $50 per day. When they disputed it, the violations multiplied. Unapproved paint color, improper mailbox placement, a cracked section of driveway that constituted a safety hazard. Within 6 months, they owed the HOA over $8,000 in fines and legal fees. They tried to fight it in court, but the HOA's attorney buried them in motions and continuances until their savings ran dry. In the end, they sold their home for $40,000 below market value just to escape. The buyer, they later discovered, was a company that traced back to Victoria's brother-in-law. James Thornton's story was different, but equally devastating. He had been a real estate attorney before early retirement, and when he started asking questions about the HOA's finances, Victoria accused him of sexual harassment. The accusation was baseless, supported by nothing but the word of a board member who claimed James had made inappropriate comments at a community barbecue. No witnesses, no evidence, just a whisper campaign that destroyed his reputation in the neighborhood. He spent $15,000 on lawyers to clear his name, but the damage was done. His wife filed for divorce 6 months later, unable to bear the constant stares and whispered gossip. Maria Santos simply shook her head when it was her turn to speak. I asked one question at a meeting about a $500 special assessment. One question. The next week, someone slashed all 4 tires on my car while I was at work. The week after that, I found a dead rat in my mailbox. She paused, her voice steady, but her eyes bright with unshed tears. I have a teenage daughter. I stopped fighting because I was afraid of what they might do next. James Thornton unfolded his arms and looked directly at me. I filed a complaint with the state 3 years ago. They opened an investigation, spent 6 months requesting documents, and then closed the case, citing insufficient evidence. You know why. Because every document Victoria provided was sanitized. Every receipt was fabricated or altered, and someone in the county clerk's office kept losing our requests for public records. He let that sink in for a moment. Her brother works in that office. Caleb, this is not just one woman with a clipboard. This is a system. She has people protecting her at every level. I felt the weight of what he was saying settle into my chest. I had suspected the corruption ran deeper than Victoria alone, but hearing it confirmed was something else entirely. These were not random acts of petty tyranny. This was an organized operation designed to extract money from the community while crushing anyone who dared to look too closely. I thanked them all for their courage in coming forward. I promised I would not stop until Victoria faced consequences, but as I drove home that night, I wondered if I was making a promise I could not keep. The call came 3 days later. I was in my home office reviewing the documents Eleanor had given me when my phone rang from a Washington, D.C. area code. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Special Agent Diana Cross from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. For a moment, I thought it was a prank, some elaborate trick by Victoria's allies to make me say something incriminating. But Agent Cross knew details she could not have known unless she was legitimate. She knew about my complaint to the state. She knew about the harassment campaign against me. She knew about the connection between Marcus Delgado's company and the HOA contracts. Mr. Huxley, your complaint was forwarded to us because it matches a pattern we have been tracking for 18 months, she said. Victoria Harmon is not just skimming money from your HOA. We believe she has laundered approximately $340,000 through a network of shell companies and fraudulent vendor contracts. Your documentation is the most comprehensive we have received from any resident. I sat down slowly, my mind racing. The FBI had been watching Victoria for a year and a half. All this time, while she terrorized neighbors and destroyed lives, federal investigators had been building a case in the shadows. Agent Cross explained that they needed an insider, someone who could provide contemporaneous documentation of ongoing financial crimes. The evidence they had was strong, but circumstantial. What they needed was proof of an illegal transaction in progress. She asked if I would be willing to cooperate. I thought about the Pattersons losing their home. I thought about James Thornton's marriage falling apart. I thought about the fear in Maria Santos's eyes when she talked about her daughter. Tell me what you need me to do. The next HOA meeting was standing room only. Word had spread that the board was planning to announce a major special assessment, and residents wanted answers. Victoria stood at the podium, looking serene and confident, as if she had already won whatever battle she was fighting. She announced that emergency repairs to the community hall roof would require a special assessment of $800 per household, payable immediately. No vote, no discussion, no itemized estimate. When I stood up to object, citing the CCNR's requirement that any assessment over $500 required a 2/3 vote of homeowners, Victoria cut me off with a wave of her hand. This is an emergency. Mr. Huxley, the board has authority to act in the community's best interest. An elderly woman near the back asked what exactly was wrong with the roof. Marcus Delgado answered without looking up from his phone. Structural damage, water intrusion, could collapse any day now. I had walked past that building an hour earlier. There was no visible damage, no water stains, no sagging. Nothing suggested imminent collapse. But Victoria was already directing people to a folding table where a board member was collecting checks and cash. I watched as frightened homeowners lined up to hand over $800 for repairs I was certain would never happen. That night, an email arrived from the HOA's attorney threatening legal action against me for continued harassment and interference with board functions. The letter demanded that I cease all inquiries into HOA finances or face a lawsuit for defamation and tortious interference. I was still reading the threat letter when my phone buzzed with a message from the anonymous account that had contacted me weeks earlier. This time, there was no text, just a link to a cloud storage folder. Inside were scanned copies of invoices I had never seen before, dozens of them, all from a company called Harmon Consulting LLC. The company's registered address was Victoria's home. The invoices totaled $67,000 over 3 years, all for community management consulting services, services that, as far as I could tell, had never been rendered by anyone other than Victoria, paying herself with money stolen from her neighbors. I forwarded everything to Agent Cross with a single line of text. When do we move? Her response came within the hour. Soon. Be ready. Maria Santos called me on a Saturday morning and asked if I could meet her at the cemetery on the edge of town. She did not explain why, just said there was something I needed to see. I found her standing near a modest headstone beneath an old oak tree, her hands clasped in front of her like she was praying. The name on the stone read, Harold Chen, beloved husband and father, followed by 2 dates separated by 71 years. I stood beside Maria in silence, waiting for her to speak. The wind rustled through the oak leaves above us, and somewhere in the distance a church bell rang the hour. He was the first, Maria finally said. The first one to stand up to her publicly, 5 years ago, at a board meeting. He demanded a full audit of the HOA finances. He was an accountant his whole life, and he knew something was wrong the moment he looked at those numbers. She paused, her voice catching slightly. Victoria destroyed him for it. Maria told me what happened next. The social media attacks came first. Anonymous posts accusing Harold of being a troublemaker, a racist, a senile old man who should mind his own business. The accusations were absurd. Harold Chen had immigrated from Taiwan in 1968, had served in the army during Vietnam, and had spent 40 years building a reputation as one of the most honest accountants in the county. None of that mattered to Victoria. She twisted every word he said, turned neighbors against him, and made him a pariah in the community he had called home for 2 decades. His health began to fail. He stopped sleeping. He lost weight. Eleanor begged him to let it go, to stop fighting. But Harold believed in something bigger than his own comfort. He believed that truth mattered, that corruption should be exposed, that good people had an obligation to stand against injustice. 8 months after that board meeting, Harold Chen died of a heart attack in his living room. The doctors said stress was a major contributing factor. She did not pull a trigger, Maria said quietly, but she killed him all the same. She took everything that made him who he was and ground it into dust. And when he was gone, she smiled at the funeral and told Eleanor how sorry she was for her loss. I drove to Eleanor's house that afternoon without calling ahead. She opened the door and saw something in my face that told her I knew. Without a word, she stepped aside and let me in. We sat in her living room surrounded by photographs of Harold. Images of a man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. A man who looked like he had never told a lie in his life. Eleanor did not cry. I think she had used up all her tears years ago. Instead, she spoke about their 40 years together, about how they met at a church picnic in 1974, about raising 2 children who now lived on opposite coasts, about the quiet happiness they had found in retirement before Victoria Harmon entered their lives. He knew he could not win, Eleanor said. He knew she had too much power, too many allies, but he said someone had to try. Someone had to show that not everyone would bow down to a bully. She looked at me with eyes that had seen too much loss. When I saw you stand up at that meeting, when I watched you refuse to back down, I thought maybe Harold's fight was not over. Maybe someone would finish what he started. I left Eleanor's house with a weight in my chest that I could not name. This was no longer just about money, or corruption, or even justice in the abstract sense. This was about a man who had died because he believed in doing the right thing. It was about a widow who had spent 5 years alone with her grief, watching the woman who destroyed her husband continue to thrive. It was about all the people Victoria had crushed, all the lives she had ruined, all the silence she had purchased with fear and intimidation. I thought about my own reasons for fighting. The flagpole, the violation notices, the principle of the thing. Those reasons felt small now, almost petty compared to what the Chens had lost. But maybe that was the point. Maybe every act of resistance, no matter how small, was connected to something larger. Maybe my refusal to back down was not just about me. It was about Harold Chen, and the Pattersons, and James Thornton, and Maria Santos, and everyone else who had been too afraid, or too broken, to keep fighting. Tessa was waiting for me when I got home, and I could tell immediately that something had happened. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open and a printed letter in her hand. Her face was pale. "Someone sent this to my parents," she said, sliding the letter across the table. It was typed on plain white paper with no return address. The message was simple and cruel. "Your daughter is making dangerous enemies in Colorado. She should learn to mind her own business before something happens to her family." I read it twice, feeling my blood turn cold. Victoria had gone after my wife's parents, people who lived 1,000 miles away, and had nothing to do with any of this. She was sending a message. No one you love is safe. Tessa's voice was steady, but I could hear the fear underneath. "They are scared. Caleb, my mother called me crying. She wanted to know what kind of trouble we had gotten into." I reached across the table and took her hand. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I had kept the FBI involvement secret to protect her, but now I wondered if that had been a mistake. She was my partner in everything. She deserved to know. "There is something I need to tell you," I said, and I told her everything. That night, after Tessa had processed the shock and the anger and the fear, we sat together in my office looking at the evidence we had gathered. The invoices, the shell companies, the forged documents, the testimonies of broken neighbors. It was enough to destroy Victoria Harmon 10 times over, but only if someone with real power was willing to act on it. I checked my phone for the 100th time. No message from Agent Cross. I walked to the window and looked out at the street. Victoria's house was dark, except for a single light in an upstairs window. I wondered if she was sleeping peacefully, confident that she had won, that she had scared us into submission like everyone else. She had no idea what was coming. My phone buzzed. A message from Agent Cross. Just 4 words. 48 hours. Be ready. I looked at the photograph of Harold Chen that Eleanor had given me before I left her house. A good man. An honest man. A man who deserved better than what he got. 48 hours, I whispered to his image, and then she pays for everything. The plan Agent Cross outlined was elegant in its simplicity. Victoria's pattern was predictable. She announced illegal fees, collected money without proper authorization, and funneled it through shell companies before anyone could object. If we could catch her accepting payment for the fraudulent roof assessment, we would have evidence of a crime in progress. The FBI had been building a case on paper for 18 months, but paper alone was not enough. They needed to catch her with her hand in the cookie jar. My role was straightforward: attend the next HOA meeting, pay the $800 assessment in cash, let Victoria take the money, and record the transaction. What Victoria would not know was that every bill had been photocopied and the serial numbers logged into federal evidence. The moment she accepted that payment, she would be completing a wire fraud transaction with marked currency. Agent Cross made it clear that the operation depended on Victoria feeling confident, even triumphant. If she suspected anything, she might delay the collection or have Marcus handle the money instead. We needed her to be relaxed. We needed her carelessness. We needed her to believe she had already won. I sent the email on a Wednesday evening, carefully crafted to sound defeated. I apologized for any misunderstandings I had caused. I acknowledged that I was new to the community and had perhaps been too aggressive in my questions. I expressed my sincere desire to move forward as a cooperative member of Oakridge Estates and promised to pay all outstanding fees at the upcoming meeting. Within an hour, Victoria responded with a message dripping with false graciousness. She thanked me for my mature reflection and assured me that the community welcomed residents who understood the value of harmony. She even suggested we might have coffee sometime to discuss how I could contribute positively to neighborhood initiatives. I showed the exchange to Tessa, who read it with a grim smile. "She thinks she broke you," Tessa said. "She has no idea she just walked into a trap." I posted a similar message to the community social media group, a public apology that made my stomach turn, even as I typed it. The responses were immediate. Victoria's allies crowed about how troublemakers always backed down eventually. A few residents sent me private messages asking if I was okay, if something had happened, if Victoria had threatened me. I did not respond to any of them. The less anyone knew, the safer everyone would be. The night before the meeting, Agent Cross called with final instructions. The arrest warrant had been signed by a federal judge that afternoon. A team of 6 agents would be positioned in and around the community hall. Disguised as residents or maintenance workers, I would enter the meeting as planned, make my payment, and then find a reason to step outside before the takedown began. The FBI wanted to minimize any risk to civilians, and they especially wanted to minimize any risk to me. I asked what would happen to Marcus Delgado. Agent Cross confirmed that a separate warrant had been issued for his arrest on charges of conspiracy and money laundering. Both targets would be taken into custody simultaneously to prevent either from warning the other. I thanked her for everything her team had done. She paused before responding. "Thank us after it is over, Mr. Huxley. These operations do not always go according to plan." I understood what she meant. Victoria was desperate, and desperate people were unpredictable. But I had spent 12 years flying into hurricanes. I knew how to stay calm when everything around me was falling apart. Tessa and I barely slept that night. We lay in bed talking through every possible scenario, every contingency, every way things could go wrong. She wanted to be in the room when it happened, to witness the moment Victoria's empire collapsed. I wanted her safe at home, far from any potential danger. We compromised. She would attend the meeting but sit near the exit, ready to leave the moment I gave her a signal. She would record video on her phone, held casually in her lap as if she was just checking messages. If anything went wrong, she would get out immediately and call Agent Cross. I hated putting her in any risk at all, but I understood why she needed to be there. This was our fight. We had started it together, and we would finish it together. Around 3 in the morning, I finally drifted into a restless sleep filled with dreams of helicopters and storms and a woman with a clipboard standing in the eye of a hurricane, untouched by the chaos around her. The morning of the meeting dawned clear and bright, the kind of Colorado day that made you believe anything was possible. I stood in my backyard drinking coffee and watching the sun climb over the mountains to the east. The new flagpole had arrived 2 days earlier, taller and stronger than the original, but I had not installed it yet. I was waiting for the right moment. My phone buzzed with a text from Harold Chen. "I am coming today, no matter what happens. Harold deserves to see this." I tried to talk her out of it, worried about her safety, but she was adamant. She had spent 5 years hiding from Victoria Harmon. Today, she was done hiding. I called Agent Cross to let her know there would be one more friendly face in the crowd, and to make sure her team knew not to mistake Eleanor for a threat. Cross assured me that her agents had photographs of every known associate of Victoria and Marcus. They knew exactly who they were looking for. At noon, I drove to my bank and withdrew $800 in 20s and 50s. The teller gave me a curious look when I asked for specific serial number ranges, but I explained I was buying something from a private seller who wanted to verify the bills. It was a thin excuse, but she did not push. I drove home and spread the bills on my kitchen table, photographing each one front and back, recording every serial number in a spreadsheet that I emailed to Agent Cross. This money would never actually reach Victoria's pocket. Within hours of her accepting it, federal agents would be cataloging it as evidence in a criminal prosecution. But she did not know that. She thought she was about to receive another tribute from another defeated neighbor, another $800, to add to the mountain of stolen wealth she had accumulated over 6 years. I folded the bills carefully and put them in an envelope in my jacket pocket. Tessa came downstairs, dressed casually, her phone fully charged and a portable battery in her purse. She looked calm, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the slight tremor in her hands. I pulled her into a hug and held her for a long moment. "After today," I said, "this is all over. We get our life back." She nodded against my chest. "And Harold Chen gets justice." We drove to the community hall separately, arriving 15 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to begin. The parking lot was already half full, and I noticed several unfamiliar faces among the arriving residents. A man in a maintenance uniform was checking the exterior lights. A woman I had never seen before was setting up folding chairs inside. 2 men in casual clothes stood near the entrance, chatting about the weather with the easy body language of people who had nothing to hide. But I recognized the subtle signs, the way they positioned themselves to watch all approaches, the slight bulge under one man's jacket. The earpiece was barely visible beneath the woman's hair. The FBI was in position. I walked into the community hall and took a seat in the front row, directly facing the podium where Victoria would stand. Marcus Delgado was already there, arranging a folding table with a cash box and a receipt book. Victoria arrived 5 minutes later, sweeping into the room in a navy blue dress that probably cost more than most residents' monthly HOA dues. She saw me in the front row, and her smile widened with genuine pleasure. The troublemaker had been tamed. The rebel had surrendered. Her victory was complete. I smiled back at her, the envelope of marked bills heavy in my pocket, and waited for the meeting to begin. Outside, I could hear the distant thump of helicopter rotors somewhere over the mountains. In a few hours, that sound would mean something very different. But for now, I sat quietly in my chair, playing the role of a defeated man, and watched Victoria Harmon enjoy the last moments of her reign. The meeting began at exactly 2 o'clock with Victoria calling the room to order. Approximately 60 residents had packed into the community hall, more than I had ever seen at a previous meeting. Word had spread about the $800 assessment, and people wanted answers. Victoria stood behind the podium in her navy dress, projecting an image of calm authority, as if the growing unrest in the room was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. She welcomed everyone with her practiced smile and launched into a prepared speech about community responsibility and shared sacrifice. "The roof repairs were essential," she explained. "The structural damage was severe. Any delay could result in catastrophic failure and potential liability for every homeowner in Oakridge Estates." She spoke with such conviction that I almost believed her myself. Almost. I glanced around the room and spotted the undercover agents in their positions. The woman setting up chairs had moved to the back corner near the emergency exit. The 2 men from outside had taken seats in the middle rows, separated by several residents. The maintenance worker had slipped in through a side door and stood against the wall with his arms crossed. Everyone was in place. Now we just needed Victoria to take the bait. Marcus Delgado stood up and announced that payment could be made immediately at the collection table. "Cash or check," he said, though cash was preferred to avoid processing delays. A few residents grumbled, but began reaching for their wallets. An elderly woman in the second row asked if she could have more time to come up with the money. Victoria's response was swift and cold. "The assessment is due today, Mrs. Yamamoto. The board has already extended significant flexibility by not requiring advance payment. We cannot make exceptions without being unfair to those who comply." Mrs. Yamamoto looked down at her hands and said nothing more. I watched 3 residents shuffle to the collection table and hand over their money. Marcus counted each payment carefully, wrote out receipts, and placed the cash in a metal lockbox. Victoria observed the process with barely concealed satisfaction, like a spider watching flies stumble into her web. After the third payment, I stood up from my seat in the front row. Victoria's eyes locked onto me immediately, her smile widening with anticipation. The rebel had come to kneel. I walked to the collection table slowly, giving everyone in the room time to see what was happening. I could feel the weight of 60 pairs of eyes on my back, the whispered confusion of neighbors who had watched me fight Victoria for months. I reached into my jacket pocket and withdrew the envelope containing $800 in marked bills. Marcus reached for it eagerly, but I held it just out of his grasp and turned to face Victoria directly. "Before I pay," I said, my voice carrying across the silent room, "I want to confirm something for the record. This $800 is for emergency roof repairs, correct? And this payment is being collected by the HOA board without a vote of the membership, under the emergency powers provision of our CCNRs." Victoria's smile flickered for just a moment before she recovered. "That is correct, Mr. Huxley. As I explained, the situation requires immediate action." I nodded slowly. "And you, as HOA president, are personally authorizing this collection?" She lifted her chin with a hint of impatience. "I am." I placed the envelope in Marcus's outstretched hand. "Then I am happy to contribute to our community." Marcus opened the envelope, counted the bills twice, and wrote out a receipt with my name and the amount. Victoria watched the entire transaction with visible pleasure, savoring what she believed was my complete submission. The trap was set. The evidence was complete. All that remained was the reckoning. I excused myself to use the restroom, walking toward the back of the hall where Tessa sat near the exit. As I passed her, I brushed my hand against her shoulder, our agreed signal that the payment had been made. She gave me an almost imperceptible nod and shifted slightly in her seat, angling her phone to capture the front of the room. I pushed through the back door and stepped outside into the afternoon sun, taking a deep breath of mountain air. The parking lot was quiet except for the distant sound of birds and the faint hum of traffic from the main road. I checked my phone. No messages from Agent Cross. I looked up at the sky, clear and blue and empty, and then I heard it, a low rhythmic thumping, so faint at first that I thought I might be imagining it. But the sound grew steadily louder, a deep percussive beat that I recognized instantly from 12 years of flying. Helicopter rotors, coming fast. The black helicopter appeared over the tree line to the east, descending rapidly toward the community hall. It was not a news helicopter or a medical transport. This was a federal law enforcement aircraft, sleek and purposeful, with no markings visible from the ground. The rotor wash hit the parking lot like a sudden storm, sending leaves and debris swirling in all directions. I shielded my eyes and watched as the helicopter touched down in the center of the lot, its engines still running, its rotors still spinning. The side door slid open, and Agent Diana Cross stepped out, followed by 4 agents in tactical vests with FBI emblazoned across the chest. They moved with practiced efficiency, fanning out toward the community hall entrance. Cross spotted me and gave a brief nod of acknowledgement before leading her team inside. I followed close behind, my heart pounding with anticipation. The scene inside the hall was frozen chaos. Residents stood or sat in stunned silence, staring at the armed federal agents who had just burst through their doors. Victoria remained behind the podium, her face cycling through confusion, fear, and defiance in rapid succession. Marcus had risen from his chair at the collection table, the metal lockbox clutched against his chest like a shield. Agent Cross walked straight down the center aisle, her credentials held high, her voice cutting through the shocked silence like a blade. "Victoria Harmon, you are under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, and embezzlement of community funds. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." 2 agents moved to flank Victoria, one on each side. She stood perfectly still for a moment, as if her brain could not process what was happening. Then something cracked behind her eyes, and the mask she had worn for 6 years finally shattered. Victoria's voice came out in a shriek that echoed off the walls of the community hall. "You cannot do this to me. I built this community. I am the one who keeps everything running without me. This place would fall apart." She turned to the stunned residents, her composure completely gone, replaced by raw fury. "You should be thanking me, all of you. Everything I did was for Oakridge, the ungrateful, the complainers, the troublemakers who questioned every decision. I dealt with them so you could live in peace, and this is how you repay me." She pointed directly at me, her finger trembling with rage. "This is his fault. He came here and poisoned everything. He turned you against me." Agent Cross nodded to her colleagues, and they took Victoria by the arms, guiding her toward the exit. She continued screaming as they led her away, her words becoming increasingly incoherent, a torrent of accusations and justifications that revealed far more than any investigation ever could. The woman who had terrorized this community with smiles and whispers was finally showing her true face, and everyone in the room could see the monster behind the mask. Marcus Delgado tried to slip out through the side door, but 2 agents were waiting for him. They took the lockbox from his hands, secured his wrists in handcuffs, and read him his rights while he stared at the floor in silence. Unlike Victoria, he seemed to understand that the game was over. There would be no more fake invoices, no more phantom contracts, no more money flowing from his neighbors' pockets into his own. The web they had built together over 6 years had finally collapsed, and there was nowhere left to hide. I watched them lead him out to a waiting SUV, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped, all his arrogance drained away in an instant. Agent Cross approached me as the room slowly came back to life, residents murmuring to each other in shock and confusion. "The marked bills are in the lockbox," she said quietly. "Combined with the documentation you provided, we have more than enough for federal prosecution. She is looking at significant prison time." I thanked her, but my attention had already shifted to someone else. Eleanor Chen stood in the back of the room, tears streaming down her face. Maria Santos had an arm around her shoulders, holding her steady. I walked over to them, pushing through the crowd of bewildered residents, and stopped in front of the woman whose husband had died fighting the same battle I had just won. Eleanor looked up at me with eyes that held 5 years of grief and loneliness and silent rage. She reached out and took my hand in both of hers, her grip surprisingly strong. "Harold," she whispered, "he can rest now. They finally got what they deserved." I did not trust myself to speak. I just nodded and held her hand while she cried, while Maria cried, while somewhere outside a helicopter engine wound down and the sound of justice faded into silence. Tessa found me a few minutes later, her phone still in her hand, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She did not say anything. She just wrapped her arms around me and held on tight. Through the window, I could see the FBI vehicles pulling away, carrying Victoria and Marcus toward their future in federal custody. The nightmare was over. The community could finally begin to heal, and somewhere, I hoped, Harold Chen was smiling. 3 months after the helicopter landed in our parking lot, I sat in a federal courtroom in Denver, watching Victoria Harmon receive her sentence. She looked different without her designer clothes and perfectly styled hair. The orange jumpsuit hung loose on her frame, and her face had taken on a grayish pallor that made her look 10 years older. The prosecutor had laid out the case methodically over several weeks, presenting evidence of wire fraud, money laundering, and embezzlement totaling $342,000 over 6 years. The shell companies, the fake invoices, the phantom vendors, the kickbacks to Marcus Delgado. Every dirty secret Victoria had buried was now part of the public record, documented in excruciating detail for anyone who cared to look. When the judge announced the sentence, Victoria showed no emotion. 7 years in federal prison, full restitution to the Oakridge Estates HOA, a lifetime ban from serving on any community board or handling association funds. Marcus Delgado received 3 years and was ordered to repay $120,000, the amount prosecutors could directly trace to his fraudulent contracts. As the bailiffs led them away, Victoria turned and scanned the gallery until her eyes found mine. There was no anger in her expression anymore, no defiance, just emptiness. I held her gaze until she disappeared through the door, and then I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for months. The new HOA board held its first meeting 2 weeks after the sentencing. James Thornton, the retired attorney Victoria had tried to destroy with false harassment accusations, was elected president by unanimous vote. Maria Santos became vice president. A young couple who had moved in the previous year volunteered to handle communications and social media. Tessa agreed to serve as a pro bono legal advisor, reviewing contracts and ensuring the CCNRs were applied fairly and consistently. The first order of business was a complete financial audit, conducted by an independent accounting firm. The second was a new transparency policy requiring all board meetings to be recorded and all financial documents to be posted online within 30 days of any transaction. Eleanor Chen attended that first meeting and spoke publicly for the first time since her husband's death. She thanked everyone who had fought to expose the corruption and asked that the community establish a small memorial garden in Harold's honor. The motion passed unanimously. When the meeting adjourned, residents lingered in the hall talking and laughing, something I had never seen happen before. The fear that had hung over Oakridge Estates for 6 years was finally beginning to lift. A letter arrived at my house a few weeks later, handwritten on plain stationery, with no return address. It was from Derek Harmon, Victoria's husband. He had moved out of state after selling their house to help pay restitution, and he wrote to apologize for everything his wife had done. He claimed he had known nothing about the fraud, that Victoria had kept him completely in the dark about her financial schemes. I believed him. Some people are so skilled at deception that even those closest to them never see the truth. Derek wrote that he was struggling to rebuild his life, that the shame of what Victoria had done weighed on him every day, that he understood if I never wanted to hear from him again. I wrote back a short response. I told him that he was not responsible for his wife's choices, that people could be fooled by those they loved, that what mattered now was how he chose to move forward. I never heard from him again, but I hope he found some measure of peace. On a Saturday afternoon in early autumn, I finally installed the new flagpole. It was steel instead of aluminum, anchored in concrete that went 3 feet deep, designed to withstand anything short of a tornado. Tessa helped me raise the flag, the same flag I had carried through 12 years of Coast Guard service, now cleaned and pressed and ready to fly again. Eleanor Chen walked over from her house across the street, moving slowly but with purpose. She carried something small in her hands, wrapped in a piece of cloth. When she reached us, she unwrapped it carefully and held it out to me. It was a military pin, tarnished with age but still recognizable, a service medal from the Vietnam War, awarded to Harold Chen for his courage under fire. "He would want you to have this," Eleanor said. "You finished what he started. You gave him justice when no one else would." I tried to refuse, told her it belonged with her family, but she pressed it into my palm and closed my fingers around it. "You are family now," she said simply. I attached the pin to the flagpole's rope, just below where the flag connected. Every time I raised or lowered that flag, I would remember Harold Chen and the price he paid for standing up against corruption. 1 year later, the Oakridge Estates community held its first annual summer barbecue by the newly renovated pool. The renovation had cost $62,000, nearly 25% less than Marcus Delgado's fraudulent bid, completed by a legitimate contractor selected through competitive bidding. Children splashed in the water while their parents gathered around picnic tables loaded with food. James Thornton manned the grill, wearing an apron that said, "World's Okayest HOA President," that Maria had given him as a joke. Eleanor sat in a lawn chair under a wide umbrella, surrounded by neighbors who stopped by to chat and bring her plates of food. Tessa and I arrived late, carrying a cooler full of drinks and a watermelon we had grown in our own backyard garden. Someone asked me to say a few words, and I reluctantly agreed. I kept it short. I told them the communities were only as strong as the people willing to protect them, that corruption thrived in silence and died in sunlight, that every person in Oakridge had the power to demand transparency, to ask questions, to refuse intimidation. I raised my cup of lemonade and offered a simple toast to neighbors who look out for each other, and to the truth, which always finds a way. As I sat back down next to Tessa, I looked up at the clear Colorado sky and thought about everything we had been through, the threats, the vandalism, the sleepless nights, the moment when a helicopter descended from the heavens and changed everything. Victoria Harmon had tried to control my property, my community, my life. She had picked the wrong fight with the wrong person, and in the end, the only thing she controlled was the size of her prison cell. Sometimes justice needs a witness. Sometimes the truth needs someone willing to stand and watch it unfold. If this story reminded you that courage is contagious, that bullies eventually face their reckoning, then you are exactly the kind of person who belongs here. Subscribe to Karma Fence and join a community that believes in accountability, in fighting back the right way, and in the simple truth that what goes around always comes around. Hit that subscribe button. The next satisfaction is already waiting for you.